Let me welcome you all here this morning. I'm Ed Lazowska from the Paul G. Allen School of Computer Science and Engineering. And this should be a really interesting session on AI in the public sector, inclusion or exclusion. As I'm sure you know, this is part of an annual set of events we have to commemorate the life of our faculty member and friend, Ben Taskar, who passed away very prematurely several years ago. We think often and always of Ben and his wife, Anat, who organized this session today, and of their daughter, Aviv. So please be thinking of Ben and his contributions and his humanity as we proceed today. This afternoon at 3:30, the annual Taskar Memorial Lecture will be delivered by Michael Jordan from UC Berkeley, who's sitting in the back. That'll be in our normal colloquium room in the EE building, and I encourage you to join us for that as well. So I think, AI is much in the news. Intelligence systems are used in all manner of areas where, for example, biases due to training data rather than explicit programming can be introduced. And that's the sort of topic we will discuss today. A year and a half ago or so, Ryan Kalo, who's on our panel, ran the first of 4 White House symposia on AI and the law at the UW Law School. And it was extremely interesting because it focused on many of these issues, on who's responsible when an autonomous vehicle has an accident, on judges' natural inclination to follow expert recommendations, whether they come from individuals or automated systems, and so on and so forth. So I think there are a set of challenges in this field that is at once incredibly promising and at the same time is making a set of decisions whose underlying logic we don't necessarily understand and they don't necessarily explain. So let me begin, if I may, by just asking each of the panelists to briefly introduce themselves and make a few remarks. And rather than spending additional time introducing them myself, we'll just go your right to left, and we'll figure out who we're going to hear from today.
Good morning, everybody. My name is Shankar Narayan. I'm the Technology and Liberty Project Director at the ACLU of Washington. What that basically means is that I look at the ways in which game-changing advancements in technology, and particularly this trend towards data-driven automated decision-making, impacts all of our civil liberties. We use organizing, we use proactive policy frameworks, and we use litigation to ensure that our civil liberties stay meaningful, in a world where data and automated decision-making can often make end runs around those sort of brick and mortar protections. And also at the ways in which technology can actually amplify bias that exists. A couple of notes about myself. So I am not a Luddite, as much as some of my remarks might cause you to think that. I started out my career in this very town in 2001 practicing technology law. I actually was at the same firm as Michael, working for a lot of the companies that drive the tech revolution now. And I also worked as the ACLU's legislative director and in immigrant rights for a decade and a half. So I have a keen appreciation of the human impact, right, and the human beings at the receiving ends of these technologies. So a lot of my work is also lifting up the voices of impacted communities in this space.
Hi, I'm Oren Etzioni. I've been a faculty member here since 1991. For the last 4 years, I've been the CEO of the Allen Institute for Artificial Intelligence, which is a few minutes by bike here on the Burke-Gilman Trail. And our mission at the Allen Institute for AI is AI for the common good. So we think about various ways in which AI can make the world a better place, and maybe get into that a little bit more. I wanted to say 2 things. First of all, I did really want to say something about Ben. He came here relatively late in my career here, and I had only met him for a few times, but he was really tremendously inspirational to me personally, even in those few times. Those of you who didn't know him, he's the kind of person you have lunch with and you walk away and you feel better about yourself, you feel better about humanity, you just have a spring in your step because he's just such a great guy. I really, really serious. And so just in his personality, in his thinking about AI. He's much more theoretical than I am, but never made me feel bad about my kind of groveling understanding of the underlying mathematics. Anyway, I just, without getting too choked up, just such a special person. What I wanted to say about AI is, I think Ed has already started framing the conversation really interestingly, and I think it captures how we feel. On the one hand, right, this technology is promising. On the other hand, it's kind of scary and opaque and all these things. And the thing I want to add to that framing is that we really need to be careful, in my mind, not to hold AI or technology in general to an impossible standard. So the question isn't, is AI ideal in some sense? Because clearly it's not, right? It's something that we build. The question is it better than what we have today? And that applies to, justice situations, right? Where we have, criminal justice and AI being used there. But really the most, I think, clear example of that, when we think about AI in cars. So many people in panels like this, and I get questions about it all the time, start talking about the trolley problem, right? The decisions that the AI will make, will it go this way, and kill the old lady, or will it go this way and kill the 4 young kids, and all these things. But that's not really the question in my mind. The question in my mind is, we have a technology today on the roads. It's called cars. It kills 40,000 people annually on our highways. It maims on the order of 1 million people. And we have an opportunity, and actually I would say a moral obligation, to deliver the next generation of the technology that's going to kill and maim fewer people. Now, when you think about it that way, do you want that or not? I'll stop there.
Thanks, Ryan.
Gosh, okay. Well, I'm Ryan Kalo. I am on the law faculty across the way, and I'm co-director of the Tech Policy Lab here at the University of Washington. The Tech Policy Lab bridges formally 3 departments, 3 schools, I should say, including this one, where Tadayoshi Kono is one of my co-directors, and the other is Batya Friedman in the Information School. And our students come from an even more diverse set of backgrounds, including 2 of our alumni and current students at the Tech Policy Lab who are from electrical engineering. So what I study primarily is how emerging, it's a version of what Shankar said, how emerging technology ends up upsetting assumptions that the law and policy hold. And so robotics and artificial intelligence are a particularly interesting one, because whereas once upon a time something was done by a person, a surgery, for example, driving a car, making a judgment about how long someone should be incarcerated. Now it's being done, at least in part, by a machine. And the law has tacitly assumed that these tasks would be human tasks. A sort of very dramatic example of that is, we require the president to be 35 years old. I mean that in sort of physically, not necessarily a mental requirement. And so you ask yourself, what if an artificial intelligence wanted to be president? Would we make it wait for 35 years, right? No. So that sort of question then percolates all the way down to, how do you ensure that a driverless car is safe enough? How do you ensure that a surgical robot that has some autonomy is safe to deploy, or safe enough to deploy? And so these kinds of questions arise also in the bias context, and I think that's what we're going to be focusing on, where with a human being, you might be able to take certain steps to try to mitigate bias or get an explanation of why the person made the decision that they did. One example is, you can strike jurors from a jury pool if you believe that they might be biased for some reason. But there's not quite that mechanism for striking an algorithm for bias. One last thing I'll say before turning it over is that the lab specifically studies how non-mainstream voices might be incorporated into tech policy. And one of the groups that we have a diversity panel around in our Diverse Voices project is those living with disability. So it's something we actually specifically think about, and I hope that we can concentrate on that a little today.
Great, thanks. Emily, the first.
My name is Emily Bender, and I'm a professor in linguistics and also adjunct faculty in computer science and engineering. I came to the University of Washington in 2003, and I'm the faculty director of our professional master's program in computational linguistics. And so I'm working in what people in computer science call NLP and maybe consider a subfield of AI. I see it as computational linguistics and something that is related but independent. I don't think of what I do as AI. But I'm happy to be in this conversation, partially because I've been involved for the last few years in a growing discussion around ethics and natural language processing, looking at the kinds of issues that arise because of the technology that we're building and because of the way that it interacts with language, which is intensely personal. Right? There's in one of the many Twitter discussions about this, someone said, the L in NLP is language, and language means people. And so whenever we're dealing with natural language data, we're dealing with things that people have said that reflect things about themselves. And we are also, if we're using what they've said to understand the world, we are picking up their way of viewing the world. And so there's a lot of issues there around how stakeholders can be impacted by our technology that I think provide an interesting counterpoint to the self-driving car trolley problem discussions, which are interesting and important, but really just one part of the larger discussion that I'm happy to be a part of about how this technology impacts our lives. And I'm also interested in how do we train people, because I run this master's program, to be sensitive to these issues so that when they go out and they're part of the workforce building them, either for companies or for public policy type usage, they know to even ask these questions. And so I've been putting some thought into how do we bring this discussion into the research community and into education, for me narrowly in computational linguistics, but I think there's a lot of resonance also in computer science education more broadly.
Mike.
Good morning. I'm Mike Phillips. I'm an attorney at Microsoft. In my current role there, I do a couple of things that are relevant to the AI space. What had been the main portion of my job was essentially what we think of as direct product support for one of the product orgs. In this case, what we today call our AI products unit, which really, frankly, about 2 years ago was Bing. And then Cortana increasingly, and now really has begun to subsume additional elements of what we think of as our AI products. But it's sort of been a fascinating experience to watch how this notion of AI and exactly trying to define what AI is has expanded, and it's drawn in various things. The Bing folks will remind me time and time again that they're really one of the best first examples of sophisticated AI. Search has been around for quite some time. We shouldn't forget that as we go off into some of the more novel things today around natural language processing and facial recognition and the like. But in that role, I do basic product support. So certainly, counseling on regulatory issues, but it runs the gamut. We have heavyweight privacy issues as part of that. We've got intellectual property issues and so on and so forth. So in that sense, it's in line with what a lot of the folks do. The other part of my job, and I think the reason I'm here today, the part that I find most interesting right now, is supporting our AI policy work. And that work stems from the Microsoft Research Organization, which is headed by Eric Horowitz, who does both our MSR lab functions, but also heads a newish group called MSR AI. And in part, what they're thinking about today are all of these very fascinating policy issues. How do we think about, as a private entity and as a significant player in this space, how do we think about notions of ethical AI, responsible AI? How do we develop AI to be trustworthy? And so in that regard, this has been fascinating for me. It's more learning experience probably than me counseling, because I'm sort of catching up, and I think a lot of folks in this space feel like they're learning something very new every day. The debates and the dialogues are fascinating, and I think there's a lot still to come. So this is an area that I'm certainly excited to work in. I've been at Microsoft about, it will be 19 years this year. I joined in late 99. As Shankar noted, I was at what was then Preston Gates and Ellis in Seattle for about 5 years. They subsequently became K&L Gates. I went to law school here at UW. And was a summer associate at Preston Gates and Ellis in about 93, and that was really my introduction to Microsoft. The Gates and Preston Gates and Ellis, of course, is Bill Gates Sr., and so at that time, Preston did a lot of work for Microsoft. And so in these 20-some years, which have flown by, it's been really kind of mind-blowing to watch the business grow and evolve and the industry grow and evolve and see what this is all about. I can say that this space right now feels about as exciting as anything that I've certainly come across in the work that I've done, and I think that's true of most of my colleagues. There's a real sense that this notion of artificial intelligence and the capability of these systems today is something that is really transformational, not only in terms of what the technology can accomplish, but again, for us as lawyers and policy advisors, some really fascinating issues and important issues that may help shape where the next decades go in the industry.
Great, thanks. Emily.
Hi, I'm Emily Keller. I'm the program manager for the Urban Analytics Unit in the Information School at UW, which is directed by Bill Howe. And one of our, the Urban Analytics Unit supports interdisciplinary research projects on urban social issues. And one of our main focuses is on the Cascadia Urban Analytics Cooperative, a partnership with the University of British Columbia. I'm also the program coordinator for the Data Science for Social Good program at the eScience Institute, which QUAC, the Cascadia Urban Analytics Cooperative, is very involved with. And we've also helped to launch a DSSG program at UBC that started last summer. I've been at UW for less than a year now. My prior position, I was the project coordinator for ethics in big data research at Data and Society Research Institute in New York, which focuses on social and ethical impacts of living in a data-centric society. And I co-authored a paper there that I'll reference today, where we interviewed computer science researchers and university librarians. That was with Bonnie Tiarina and Dana Boyd. And that brings up a lot of sort of insights on critiques about ethics, how ethical issues arise largely from lack of clarity and not necessarily malicious intent, which I think is sort of important to remember. And my background is in journalism, reporting on city government and transit accessibility in New York.
So what we're going to do is consider a small set of topics that we've thought about a bit in advance, and then we'll have time for questions from you to the panelists, and we'll be done at 2 minutes to 12 because I have to get on a conference call at noon. So I promise that we'll be on schedule. So first, let's talk about sources of bias in AI, and let me begin with Oren and Emily Bender, and maybe you can talk a little bit, beginning with you, Oren, perhaps, about how bias arises in models, in training data, and so forth.
Sure. I was a little bit worried when Ed said, let's talk about source of bias in AI, and let's start with Oren. But I know what you mean. So, this is really a very simple, non-technical point that's really quite fundamental, right? What's called AI today very much builds on data, right? Whether it's language data or, in a vector representation, doesn't matter. And data is capturing what happened in the past, right? The data has been captured and labeled. It's always from the past. And then we build from it models of a variety of kinds, and whether they're, old-style decision tree models that were actually invented at the University of Washington sometime before the last, Stone Age, or whether it's, deep learning models that were just created. It's the same thing, right? Data is mapped statistically to a model. When that happens, right, as Emily was saying, you're capturing the bias that was in that data, right? Whatever decisions, right, were in that data, whatever noise, whatever values, if it's that kind of data, those are being captured in that data set. So anything that you build on top of that is either going to be, great if it's great data, or it's going to be really bad if it's bad data. And you see that in whatever, the Microsoft Tie thing, right, that started spouting, whatever racist, sexist, Nazi stuff, because that was its data. So that's point number one, right? And I think it could be summarized with the computer science adage, garbage in, garbage out. There's a more subtle point, which is the models that we build attempt to summarize, compress, perform statistical transformations on that data that amplify whatever signal is available in that data. So what's interesting and potentially problematic with, again, AI/machine learning techniques, but it goes right back to statistics, is that the bias, sexist or otherwise, that you find in that data is going to be even stronger when the model is done with it, right? That's just actually the nature of the beast. So now there are technical things we can do about that, but I want to just underline the point that it's very, very fundamental. And if you don't like the past, right, then you have to think about how we correct the models that provide us with predictive guidance for the future, at some point, I guess, in the present. Let me stop there.
Thanks, Oren. That actually sets up very nicely, and I was thinking about it in similar ways. Like my first note here is that the whole point of AI is to find patterns and then deploy them. And the problem is in the mismatch between the patterns you've learned and the context of deployment. And so I think that garbage in, garbage out might actually be a little bit too simple, because you can have something where it's a perfectly fine data set, but it's being used for a different purpose, and then it's not a good match. Right? Or it can be a perfectly fine data set for one aspect of it, but you're not aware of the other stuff, maybe lint rather than garbage that's attaching. And so I brought some specific examples. I was on Twitter this morning. I follow lots of people with interesting political ideas these days, and I noticed this campaign ad for a candidate posted by a person that I follow and respect. And oddly, the campaign ad was cropped in the picture view to show the person's from the neck down. Well, I thought, I bet this is an African-American candidate. Sure enough, it was. And what's going on there is that the face recognition models that are behind the choice of the preview that Twitter's using to show with a little bit of the picture were trained predominantly on data sets with white faces. And so they don't work so well. Basically, the darker the skin tone, the worse off it is. And it tends to recognize men better, too. And so, yep, sure enough, African-American woman, her Twitter ad wasn't even an ad. It was something that someone was voluntarily resharing, right? Was not being as effective as it would have been for a white candidate because of this thing about the algorithm, about the training set. So there's this mismatch between what was used for training and how it's being deployed in the world, number one. And then the other thing I want to bring up is this instance of where the patterns that are being picked up are not the patterns that we intend to deploy or want to deploy. And there's two really poignant examples that I have of that. One comes from an article in ACM by Professor Latanya Sweeney from 2013. She was in someone's office, and they were looking up, I see some nods, and people know this story. Someone searched her name in Google in order to find a paper she'd written. And in the ads bar, up popped something like, has Latanya Sweeney ever been arrested? So Professor Sweeney goes and does an extremely careful study looking at this and finds that African-American sounding names get that phrasing of the ad significantly more often than white sounding names. And this is, she carefully chooses people who don't show up in any arrest records. So it's just about how the name sounds. And in her documentation of this, she basically just documents the problem, and she doesn't, she's not in that methodology able to figure out exactly where it's coming from. But one possibility that I think is a really strong one is that it has to do with what the algorithm was optimizing. And the algorithm was optimizing on clicks, all right? And there was two different ways of phrasing this ad. And what the algorithm saw was that if you had a black sounding name and the has been arrested phrasing, that generated more clicks. And so over time, it learned to do that. Now, this doesn't mean that anybody deliberately said we're going to put this in there, but you have this pattern in people's behavior. And in this case, it's not even the behavior that was original training data, because it's online learning, right? And that's getting amplified in ways that we as a society, I sure hope, do not want. Second example of that, and then I'll finish, is this blog post by Rob Spear. And the blog is called something like ConceptNet Number Batch, I think. And he was looking at word embeddings, which are representations of the meanings of words trained by looking at what all words co-occur with. And they get deployed in lots of natural language processing tasks these days. And so he was building a few, and one was sentiment analysis. So this is about figuring out from some text how the author of the text feels about something, and the canonical task here is predicting the stars on a restaurant Yelp rating or an Amazon rating based on the text. So this is restaurants. And what he found was that his system was systematically underestimating the stars for Mexican restaurants. And he looked deeper, and what he found was that those word embeddings were trained on general web text, all right, where you had lots of people's probably tweets and blog posts, and also I want to put quotes around news articles associating people from Mexico with crimes and drug use and other negative stereotypes that are out there because of the biases in the world and the narratives that some of our politicians like to put forward. All of this language is out there. And so when you look at what the meaning of Mexican is according to where that word shows up, you get all these negative associations. And so this other context where this word is being used, not just trying to model that language, but trying to predict how good a restaurant is based on the text of a review, said, oh, well, Mexican doesn't sound good. All right. So all that to say, to recap, it's in the mismatch between the data and what we're using the data for, or rather the models trained on the data and what we're using those models for. And that mismatch can just be the data wasn't representative, or it picked up a lot of lint or maybe garbage that wasn't what we were particularly interested in, but it's in there because when you're grabbing language, you're grabbing everything someone said. And when you're grabbing photos, you're grabbing everything that was in the photo. And I'll stop there.
To the point of optimizing for clicks, I read yesterday in a source that I assumed wasn't fake news that during the last election, Facebook charged the Republican candidate less for placing ads than the Democratic candidate because those ads were more provocative and therefore generated more clicks and presumably made it possible to display more ads. So, we are what our objective function is. So let me turn this to Shankar, and there are a set of, in some sense, issues beyond technical issues that need to be considered with AI in the public sphere and equity.
Yeah, that's right. So, I think my comments on this will in part draw on what has been said by the last two speakers, but also maybe place it in a slightly different framework. And in order to do that, I just want to take a step back and kind of look at what I think the prevailing narrative around technology is right now that's out there, right? That our human systems are biased and broken, which they are, by the way. I completely agree with that. I've spent a lot of my life trying to fix those broken and biased human-based systems. But that technology is a neutral thing that comes in and solves the problems, right? That's the narrative, that technology is more neutral than human beings and therefore can counteract the bias in our human systems. I think the challenge with that is actually it's simply not true, right? That technology, every deployment of technology, including in AI and certainly in the public sector, is a series of value choices, right? There are all of these little decisions that go into how you create a technology. Everything from, point number one is, what problem are you asking the technology to solve, right? That in itself frames your entire prospect of success or failure, right? It's a very different thing to say, give me a risk assessment of whether this person may recidivate versus give me the best possible interventions to ensure this person does not recidivate, right? Those are two very different things, but they frame the entire debate about the tool in completely different ways. And who gets to ask, who gets to create the question that's asked of the tool? I think often you see tools created by vendors driving the conversation because they come to local governments to sell that tool. And drive the terms of the debate where local governments don't feel they have the sophistication or understanding of the tool to push back and ask the right questions. Then, of course, the bias amplification in the data that's already been talked about. What data sets do you use? How do you weight different factors, right? So to take the example of predictive policing and many other risk assessments, I think a common problem is that they often overweight false negatives, right, and underweight false positives, because in someone's quote, I think someone said something like, it's much better to incarcerate Luke Skywalker than it is to let out Darth Vader, right? But then again, we may not agree with that, right? Many of us actually don't agree with that, particularly those of us who have spent a lot of time working to break down the biases in our criminal justice system, right? That's a value choice. And I guess my proposition to you all is that right now, those value choices are actually being made unaccountably, right? They're being made in the black box of technology vendors, often without the right public input to be able to shape what the tool does. And on the back end, of course, I think you had mentioned this, Emily, as well, that the tool is implemented by human beings, right? So it contains all of the limitations of how human beings use a tool. And all of those actors also have sets of political incentives around them, right? So predictive policing, again, a good example, a tool that purports to tell you who is going to commit a crime, when they're going to commit a crime, right? These tools are in use in a lot of cities. You may have seen in the news just this week, Palantir used a predictive policing system in New Orleans, tested, quote unquote, a predictive policing system in New Orleans. There was no public debate, right? Nobody actually even knew among the public officials who were purportedly supposed to be overseeing technology deployments in the city that this was out there. And of course, every technology deployment has winners and losers, right? So what's the impact on community trust of a system of predictive policing being deployed, particularly if that system relies on historic data that, as Oren, clearly captured, can actually amplify bias. That's a public debate that we are not having. And I think, part of the challenge is also, what is better, right? So in order to be able to have that public debate, we need to be able to get into, if not the algorithm, right? I'm not, it's not necessarily true that we need to crack open the algorithm. We at least need to know how the tool is making decisions, which of course gets very complicated in the machine learning context where nobody knows, right, in many ways how at point A and point B and point C, how the tool is making decisions. But I guess, what I would say ultimately is someone needs to decide what is better. So, your question, Oren, was, the tool doesn't have to be perfect. It's just got to be better than what we've got. My question is, what is better, right? Who decides what is better? Is it better to have a tool that incarcerates fewer people but continues to incarcerate the people who have been overrepresented in our criminal justice system? I'm not quite sure that that would be the case. These are value choices, right? You may have two laudable objectives that are actually in conflict with each other. Right now, that choice is hidden somewhere within the workings of the tool. I would suggest that a good first step would be to get to transparency mechanisms to surface that the tool is there, actual accountability mechanisms so that particularly the voices of impacted communities can be heard in this space, and then ultimately to actual fairness and proactive policy frameworks, which I know we're going to discuss later. So that's maybe a slightly different framework on how to look at these tools.
Great. I think Oren had a comment.
Yeah, what's a panel without a little bit of controversy? So I actually very much agree with what you're saying, and I think. I'm sorry?
So this is controversy?
Not controversial enough.
I'm getting there. This is the foreplay.
Relax.
And I think you'll find strong agreements among us. I love Ed's phrase, right? We are our objective functions, right? So what, right, the values that are encoded. Nevertheless, not to pick on your words, but I do think it's an important distinction. You started with saying, people say technology is not neutral. And I just want to suggest another framing of saying I think most of us would agree that a pencil is neutral, right? It's neutral technology, and you can use it to write some very nasty things. You can use it to write some very, good things. So I think what you were saying is that while the base technology, right, an algorithm that optimizes some function is pretty neutral, even though it's more sophisticated than a pencil in some ways, it's the technology deployment, which is where, right, a bunch of these small and big value judgments are made when we set the objective function, when we choose the level of transparency, when we choose the level of discussion around it. So I just think it's worth making that distinction, and I completely agree that we need to do our technology deployments very thoughtfully for all the reasons and the great examples that you gave. But I think it's distraction from that to talk about technology not being neutral. The base technology is really no different than a pencil.
If I may just clarify what I was saying, so I actually don't think it's just the deployment, right? I think it's beginning to end. And again, starting with the very question we asked the technology. So risk assessments is a great example of an instance where what the vendor has chosen to create, right, which is a risk assessment, is actually dragging the conversation back into a place that many of us had tried to move our criminal justice system forward from, right? So a static risk assessment is only judged on the basis of how well it predicts, right? It's not, correlation is not causation, right? It doesn't tell you anything about what causes behavior to change. But what it does do, and what it has done, right, is result in a situation where vendors come to local governments with a given technology and they say this is going to be really good at predicting risk, right? Whether it's in the pretrial context, whether it's in parole decisions, or whether it's in sentencing, right? All of these predictive tools are in use. And of course, there's a major legal problem there about, whether you can see the basis of the decision making of the tool. But part of what I'm suggesting is that these things, their very existence is not neutral, right? I think this is very unlike a pencil in my view, because all of the decisions that go into creating the tool to solve the problem are being made, right, in a way that isn't involving the communities that are most impacted by the rollout of the tool. And they actually have no way, right? There's no accountability to get to how you fix that. So what I'm actually arguing for is more of a precautionary principle, right? Everything we're doing in this space, in my view, rests on the assumption that bias is fixable, right? And that we are going to roll out a technology, and if it has bias, we'll come back and fix it. Guess what? As it turns out, as Oren has already said, it's extremely difficult to do that, right? Even if you build a tool from the ground up, considering bias, it turns out, and I've seen some recent sort of meta studies on this, right, where you do these comparative performances of tools that were designed with bias in mind versus not. And there's actually not much performance difference, right, if any. So we're at a very initial stage of doing that. And I've also seen politically, right, when we roll out a tool, when government in particular rolls out a tool, right, we're talking about the public sector, it's often one and done, right? The tool rolls out. No one wants to then go back and hear, oh, your tool isn't working properly, let's tweak or fix it, or let's replace it with something else. That's why I think it's really important to get it right at the outset and demand a better set of choices, right? So I don't actually think it is just a tool that is better by whoever's definition of what previously was there. I actually think that the entire process of creating these technologies needs to be relooked at in a way that's more inclusive. There are governments that are starting to do that, and we can talk about that when we get to proactive frameworks.
Okay, we'll hopefully come back to this later. I want to compliment Oren on how he addressed Shankar. I was taught a number of years ago that when you want to contradict somebody, you begin by saying, I'd like to build upon that. And what that means is I disagree with you totally. Ryan, you had something to say.
Well, I mean, so I think that this is a critical point, right? So a pencil, right? Yikes. I mean, a pencil is erasable, so it assumes you can make mistakes. It has to be a certain width, which may be better or worse for people depending on the size of their hands, which is a component of age and gender and ethnicity and the like. A pencil is made out of wood, and so it has environmental impacts and so on. I mean, it's what's interesting is that as a law professor, while my main area of study is law, I draw from things like science and technology studies to evidence that indeed, nothing is that lacks complexity like that, right? There is no such thing, and then this is a whole debate dating back at least to the 1980, but probably preceding that, into whether or not it's conceivable to have a human technology that does not embed some kind of values. What I think is critical to understand about the law is that tools deployed in law have a particular salience because we have made a set of guarantees to litigants and other people's affected by laws, and because, to borrow from Robert Cover's excellent article, legal interpretation takes place on the field of pain and death, by which Cover meant, if a legal decision doesn't go your way, you wind up being deprived of your liberty or of your resources or even of your life. So we have to be particularly careful when we use a pencil as evidence in a courtroom, and when we calculate how long a defendant should be put in jail using a pencil. It's just that's so exciting about the law, but also what's so perilous. The second thing I would say, just briefly, is that technologists, I think, ought to be looking to the law for how to design these systems in ways that are more fair, because we've literally been thinking about this for hundreds of years, right? I mean, that is the obsession of civil and criminal and administrative procedure. And so there's a lot of stuff to draw from. My impression from reading the literature and from engaging with people who are building fair systems is that there's not an explicit reference to the law. In fact, the place that happens most often is in the corporate sector, where the researchers at Microsoft, for example, are able to draw from Mike and his colleagues. But again, are Mike and his colleagues necessarily thinking about the deep goals of procedure? I think that they're very thoughtful, and perhaps they are. My point is that when you use these tools, they're not neutral. Even the pencil in a criminal justice system, it really matters. And second of all, the criminal justice system itself has a set of tools that you may deploy within design to help ameliorate some of the problems.
Okay, we've already skated well into our second topic, which is good because we've skated well into the second topic's time. So let's talk about uses of AI in the public sector. And we've heard about predictive policing. We've heard about recidivism prediction. Mike, what are some other examples, particularly ones that people may not be as familiar with?
Yeah, happy to speak to that. And I'm glad we did the skating because I think it did set this up nicely. I mean, certainly we've heard a lot, and there's a good deal of attention paid right now to the situations in criminal justice, in policing. So certainly, we're seeing a lot of interest among governments in utilizing AI to assist with law enforcement and national security. And of course, much like with any of these situations, the debates rage between, hey, this is net beneficial, and there are some costs that come with it, not unlike the existing criminal justice system where you're already dealing with issues of human bias. How does the law today address issues of the potential for a judge to be biased against a particular race or a class of citizens? I mean, that's something we've lived with for as long as humankind has been in existence, but we've sort of had a system. Today, there's this great hope that, oh my goodness, with these tools, in fact, you've got the ability to take decisions that typically would take humans much, much longer and would surpass a human's ability to sort of grasp information. You can take more information, you can feed it in, you can do it more quickly, you can move faster and presumably have less biased results is one assumption and one argument. And yet, as this argument has, or this discussion has shown, how do you start to parse that out? And I think one of the critical things that we're looking at as we're looking at what sort of interesting deployments are going on in the public sector now is just how hard is this stuff really to understand? I think that's the crux of where some of these problems lie, as Shankar noted, getting to the bottom of how these systems are working. Again, I think we recognize that typically these systems are deployed in situations where they're capable of surpassing human capability to process quantities of information in the times that we're talking about. So, wow, what a challenge it's going to then be to introduce notions of humans being able to inspect what's happened and correct that. So with that sort of as the background, we're seeing tremendous interest from governments and deployments already across what I consider to be a spectrum. I've sort of made this up myself in terms of things that I feel pretty good about and things that really terrify me. And at the two ends are things like, access to government services. A lot has been done to make government services more quickly accessible through AI and machine learning. There's a great example in Australia.
Individuals who don't have access to
basic technology. Great point. And so there's a lot of research being done there to figure out, in addition to making these services available, can we bring internet access, for example, into more rural communities in a way that makes this.
An organization in Seattle, the Access to Justice Foundation, that Judge John Horowitz founded a number of years ago, that works on these topics.
Absolutely. And so these all come together very nicely. I mean, it's a great point. It's serving a goal, which is, geez, we think it would be fantastic, and the Australia example is a great one, to try and make disability services available more readily through AI interfaces where people with disabilities can go and access what are in essence bots in a way that's designed specifically to address the disabilities that may be at issue. It's actually easier than having to find a way to talk to another human or to get access to these services. But it very much entangles these sorts of questions. Hey, fundamentally, can people get to this stuff at all? But again, at one end of the spectrum, I think of services like that, where what really they're trying to do, and I think there's a lot of promise and some really good results in making things like access to disability services, access to insurance services, access to healthcare, even access to taxes. How do you file your taxes and do your taxes if some of the complexity of that can be taken out of the system, if people can more quickly find out the status of an audit, for example, through these sorts of systems? Isn't that a net positive? And I think the answer is generally yes. There are great arguments to be made that these are net beneficial services, and yet they come with all these same questions. Do people really have access? Is the data that's being used to train these systems correctly matched? Do we know what's really going on behind the curtain? And that's where it gets really challenging. you go to the other end of the spectrum, and I think of the deployment of AI in military contexts. From what I've been reading lately, and this is not based on anything I hear at work, but this is just, you pick up The Economist, and a few weeks ago had their special issue on the future of warfare, and most of the space was dedicated to what will happen when AI truly gets deployed. And I think the reality is, today, I'm sure that there's a lot going on in defense research in this country, in China, in Russia, you name it, where a lot of AI and autonomous system use is being pushed. And what does that mean? But I'm here to tell you, I think that there's no question that sort of investment is going to continue and it's going to scale. I mean, in essence, some could argue that's where the next arms race will be. I think that's probably right. And so how do we get our arms around what could that mean? If we can't understand how data is used, and that may factor into, when you get into a queue to get some tax audit reviewed. What happens when you've got drones that could be operating in milliseconds based on, issues in the field, and how in the world do you ever expect to ensure that humans can monitor that? But again, I think there's quite a bit of interest there, and I think that at the same time that you worry about these sorts of issues, you can make a lot of arguments about why deployment of these sorts of technologies in a military context could actually be a very good thing, to the extent that they can overcome human limitations or biases or concerns. Then there may be some real promise and benefit. And then everything in between. We're again seeing a lot of interest in this work in law enforcement and surveillance. And we could have a debate just on that one. I know, like some will argue, wouldn't it be fantastic if we could deploy police services in a way that helps reduce the number of shootings in neighborhoods in Chicago? And phrase that way, you might say, well, gosh, of course, if ultimately through the use of this technology we can reduce murder rate, we can reduce death and injury from gunplay, let's go research it. But of course, the worry becomes, all right, well, how have you built the system, and how is it determining where to send your police resources? Is the bias essentially police data, which may, some would argue, be already discriminatory in that you've had a heavier policing presence in disadvantaged neighborhoods? And so in the same way that some of these other issues surface, we need to be able to develop the sorts of transparency and systems and human understanding of these sorts of things that enable us to ask those questions.
Let me ask all the panelists this question, if I may. Are there specific examples you can cite of AI systems deployed in the public context that have significantly enhanced equity? What are something you would point? We can all point to ones that have exhibited bias. What are some ones that have seriously enhanced equity?
I don't know that I could say for certain that I know that this is enhanced equity, but I will say, back on this question of access to resources, I know that there's been quite a bit of work within the healthcare space and trying to take just sort of decades and decades of very disparate data sources and make some of that data more easily accessible and crunchable. And there are, through private-public partnerships, I think a lot of work to actually take tremendous volumes of data and make it more searchable, certainly make it more available to machine learning systems. And I think through that, some might argue, look, in addition to being able to diagnose much more quickly and effectively, and therefore have real benefits to healthcare generally, I think some would argue that also helps ensure that there is more equal access to quality healthcare, in that typically people who may have gone to have the genomic sequencing done to get guidance on where to go, those are expensive propositions, and that's not really been something that's been available broadly. And I think through these sorts of systems, there's an argument that kind of technology becomes available much more broadly to those who typically may not have had the access to that.
Any others have specific examples?
Here's one that's again not as life-changing as healthcare, but it shows some of the nuances here. So there's a field called bibliometrics, which is a fancy word for citation counts. And you would be amazed how many decisions are made or influenced based on raw Google Scholar citation counts, which are incredibly noisy. But again, in the real world, decisions are made or influenced by noisy and dirty data. Well, citation counts include self-citations. There's studies that show that men tend to cite themselves more than women do, all other things being equal. Citation counts are also very strongly, well, everything is historical, strongly backweighted towards the past, right? So to the extent that we had fewer women in science, in the 80s than, in the 2000s, the raw citation counts are going to be twisted by that. We at the Semantic Scholar Project at AI2, this is our search engine, have a bunch of citation metrics that are far from perfect, but they do things like remove self-citations for both, fairness reasons. They also reduces that sexist impact, are more weighted towards the current citation rates, let's say citation velocity, citation rates, rather than cumulative incremental citations. So you could look at citation rates more recently, and other things like that. So I do think that in a small way that helps, not solves, some of the biases in citations.
Yeah, please.
Just want to say a quick sentence on that. I think your question is very hard to answer for a very specific reason, which is that I think we haven't actually incentivized the testing of bias to the extent that we need. So, I could cite systems that I think have been beneficial, but I think the reality is, no one's actually tested them, right? And one thing that needs to change in our view is baking in the process of back-end testing, in addition to the front-end building a tool to consider biases from the ground up. And then maybe we'll have a more uniform system, but we are nowhere near, as far as I can tell right now, in agreement about how to even quantify bias in these tools.
Let me ask Ryan, if I may, for a really quick, please, tutorial on where AI interfaces with the law and how the law views AI, or where they bump up. We know, for example, that the law assumes actors are human, and so on and so forth. So where do we abut?
Well, I'll try to make this really, really quick. First of all, the law has to deal with artificial intelligence as a facet of the world, and that can create problems where say a machine behaves in a way that the creators of the machine did not predict. That can complicate civil and criminal liability, right? So judges have to be aware of this. Litigants are using artificial intelligence increasingly. One of the uses I've seen is forum shopping. The idea being that assuming you can reach a defendant anywhere, crunch the numbers and figure out who's been more favorable to the specific claim that you want to bring and bring it there. Of course, artificial intelligence of some kind, which let's be honest, is just a set of techniques. Not any one thing, is introduced into evidence into courts, so that people will use certain techniques in order to try to prove something in a court, and has to be evaluated for that purpose. It's used by the courts themselves in order to make decisions. Sometimes by the legislature will mandate that a court system refer to an algorithm. It's used in the investigation stage in order to determine where resources should be allocated for police, for example. And I think we're likely to see it increasingly be an input for whether there's been probable cause. So you imagine officers wearing augmented reality and getting what was formerly taser to crunch the numbers on their body cameras and try to help the officer understand whether there's an issue here, which ultimately could go a number of ways. It also could, in theory at least, reduce officer bias. It's a non-exhaustive list. I do think one of the things that it recommends, or one of the things that follow from it, is that folks who design systems, right, should anticipate that their systems will interact in some way with the law, either be used in a legal context, right, or that the results of the system will be challenged by litigants, which in part means that you shouldn't be allowed to hide behind secrecy, trade secrecy, for example, but also that the system should be able to comply with the kinds of guarantees we have already made. So I hope that's a brief summary of some of the ways that they intersect.
Let me ask a question that's not directly related, but it's been in the news recently. There was an article in the New York Times about Google on the weekend. You probably read the Times Sunday magazine. And what it pointed out is that when smaller companies move into a sector that Google is active in, okay, it frequently occurs that their placement, essentially the ranking algorithm changes and their placement declines, okay, and therefore clicks decline. And in some sense, Google's argument, and it's a plausible argument, is we're working to give the customer what he or she wants, okay? So for example, when they ask about a particular restaurant or type of food, they want to see a menu rather than a pointer to Yelp. And therefore, we scrape Yelp, okay, and deliver that information directly, okay? So this has attracted interest in Europe because several of these situations are European. I wonder how the law might deal with that sort of behavior, where on one hand you have an argument that we're giving the customer what he or she wants, and on the other hand we have a systematic situation in which when someone innovates in a particular area, their rankings wind up declining because of changes to the search algorithms.
I mean, thanks, Ed. I'm curious to hear what Emily has to say about this, because I know something data and society has studied rather closely, these sort of skewing effects of platforms. As a legal matter, what I can say with relative confidence is that U.S. Antitrust doesn't really contemplate this as being anti-competitive, but some people think that it should, and certainly European law, there's a little more traction there for it. But as a matter of U.S. antitrust law, arguments that Google is harming Yelp, or arguments, even arguments saying that Facebook can make a tiny change to its algorithm and completely destroy a business, those things don't seem to register on a U.S. legal radar. But anyway, with that, if you guys have thought about that.
So one issue I would raise about that is there's Emily had mentioned some of the issues with bias in online data, but the consent issues that come up with reusing public data and the different meanings of public data when something is out there, is it really intended to be reused in future research? And one of the things that we found in our research at Data and Society was just significant concern from researchers about this idea of secondary data use. And we had one example of someone who had published a report that included tweets, and someone Googled the tweet and was able to re-identify one of the participants. So as a result, the professor who we had interviewed discussed some new policies that they put in place to protect anonymity of their subjects. So they decided that they would alter quotes over a certain number of words in papers if they were using social media posts, and removing metadata and other identifying factors. So I think, just thinking about the whole idea of what it means to really have public data out there. I imagine with Yelp too, people put some of their personal information, personal stories out there, and if you're web scraping, there's a lot of private information that wasn't really intended to go further.
So let's continue to push down the privacy direction for a minute. I'm sure you've got a lot to say about that. I think I was recently led one of many amicus briefs in a Microsoft case of this data center in Ireland. And roughly what happened is that the US government wanted access to the contents of an individual's email who resided in Ireland, and the email was in an Irish data center. And this went to the Supreme Court earlier this week, and it looks like it's going to be a close call. I'm very naive. I know nothing about either AI or the law. So my view is that if the US government wants access to the contents of an individual's Hilton hotel room in Dublin, there are some Irish laws that need to be complied with. It seems kind of obvious to me. But I think this whole question of data privacy and access to data looms large these days. And you've touched on it, Emily. Do you have more to say?
Yeah, so one other example, working with, I see Meg Young, and so on the Transportation Data Collaborative, led by Bill Howe, John Whittington, and Mark Hellenbeck, there's a lot of issues coming up around the emerging danger of re-identification with geolocation data. And it's been interesting studying some other data repositories around UW and the ways that oversight varies by field. So when it comes to a lot of the medical databases, there's very specific guidelines under HIPAA regarding governance guidelines, things like stripping out identifiers and individual records and date shifting. And with transit data, there's a lot more ambiguity. So there's so some of the repositories around UW have recommended educating users on data access and sharing policies, and understanding there's sometimes a fuzzy line between whether data is being used for research or quality improvement, and someone can intend to use it for one. It can get pretty complicated. and trying to have an audit trail to understand who's accessed sensitive data in the case of a data breach. So transit data and just the strong re-identifiable factors of looking at without someone's name, all the different, looking at their location points, I think is just a newly emerging threat to be sort of dealt with differently.
The thing that I'd like to point out, and I actually think this applies to a lot of the things we've talked about, but let me just stay with the privacy issue, is that there's often a balance in question, right? So who's opposed to privacy, right? Clearly, we have a right to privacy and so on. But the balance question, I just saw a call that talked about how child trafficking or sex trafficking, child pornography users are making use of advanced privacy technologies, right, encryption and so on, to protect their completely abhorrent and very I don't have words for it, damaging use of technology. And so if we just think about these issues from the point of view of, sure, we want to preserve privacy, what we're doing is giving and protecting and advocating for tools that terrorists, pornographers, and child abusers use with impunity. I'm not actually taking a position on what's the right balance here, but I think that many discussions don't even think about that there needs to be a balance. Right? It feels good to have Apple, to know that Apple's got our back, right? They're not going to release what's on the device, right? But I think it would be easy to talk about real life situations where I think it would be good for law enforcement to have access to what's on the device.
Can I jump in
Please.
a little bit there? I think that that's a really important point about value tensions. And there's cases where we have the value of privacy and then we have the value of preventing abhorrent behavior, for example. And I think also in very specific cases, we can look and say, okay, whose privacy is at issue here and what are we doing to protect it? And to actually, like Shankar was saying, from the get-go, say, here's our goals. These are the people who are impacted. These are the specific reasons why we need to protect their privacy. And I think that some of those questions become more tractable. And I think it's also important when we talk about re-identification in the language context to really be aware of if you build a model that's learning things like n-gram frequency, and then you say, okay, I'm just going to hand you the model. You don't have the data, you just have the model. You're not really protecting the privacy of the people whose data built that model. If you put in a rare enough token and then say, what's the most likely thing to come after this? It can actually spit out quite a bit of information, right? And if you want to get sort of a visceral sense of that, think of the predictive text on search, right? You can get a sense of what everybody's looking for. And if you knew how to game that, you could get pretty detailed information out of things. So I think to bring in privacy as one of a set of values and say, in this context, as we're designing this technology, who are the stakeholders and what are their values that we need to respect here? Then how does that inform what we do is probably the way forward.
Yeah, please.
Just to add to that as well, I agree with everything you just said, and I think it illustrates as well just some of the limitations in our current legal frameworks, right? I'm the first to admit that the evolution of how we interpret our Constitution and our statutes has not kept up with technology, right? So in theory, right, you have an interest in the integrity of the legal system under the First Amendment. You have equal protection and due process under the Fifth and 14th Amendments. You have a right to confront your accuser under the Sixth Amendment. But how does this all play out, right? It's all, first of all, very difficult to even get to court because often, right, we don't actually have the transparency mechanisms to know that an algorithm is at play and that some level of automated decision making is happening and that it was actually the algorithm. Often there's also the fig leaf of human discretion on top of that. So you can always argue, oh, it was the person just informed by the algorithm. But on top of that, right, there are just some very, very novel questions, right? So if a tool is making decisions not on the basis of a prohibited category like race or gender, but on the basis of something that's very closely correlated with race, say like your zip code, right? Is that unconstitutional or not? Nobody knows. And right now, I think we're even a stage behind that in terms of litigation, where we're trying to litigate around the ability to examine the tools that are out there. So, there are all these statutes, I would argue, are antiquated, like the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act or DMCA, right, which Congress passed in a panic a long time ago because, oh my God, cyber stuff, right? We got to do something, and they have become offensive weapons in some ways to get back any scrutiny within the black box. I think the same goes for trade secret and also private NDAs, right? So we're still at the point of litigating. If you were convicted on the basis of an algorithm that said your DNA is more likely than a random person's to be a part of this mixed forensic sample, and the jury convicts you on the basis of that, you don't then get the right to examine the algorithm itself that was a part of convicting you. Is that fair? That's a case we're appealing in California. And there are a number of others where we're just trying to get to step one of looking at what happened in order to help then consider whether there's a challenge to be brought on the basis of the Constitution.
So Ryan touched on antitrust law. Let's talk about anti-discrimination law. Does it even apply to AI systems?
Yeah, I mean, there's a really great piece on this by Solon Barakis, who's at Cornell Information Science, and Andrew Selps, who is a trained in law and is a fellow at Data and Society, I think now actually, that talk about big data's disparate impact and precisely how do we think about this puzzle. So a couple of different things. So first of all, as Oren alluded to already, much of what contemporary artificial intelligence is good at is spotting patterns, right? And as Shankar has alluded to repeatedly, and some others have alluded to too, you have a system that spots patterns and comes up with these correlations that we don't know what the total basis of it is. And a contemporary anti-discrimination law hinges largely on intent. Even in disparate impact, disparate impact is the legal notion that if you have a change, for example, a test for firefighters, and it seems like for some reason it disproportionately excludes, say, Latinos, and it happens at a sufficient basis, that can then form a kernel of doubt that you can use to challenge that underlying law. But ultimately, what the courts are going to look at is whether you were intentionally discriminatory or at a maximum level, should you have understood that you were being discriminatory. And so obviously for that reason, artificial intelligence complicates that picture. The other thing, just to bring it back to privacy for one moment, is a major issue is that because it's so good at pattern recognition, artificial intelligence can increasingly derive the intimate from the available. In other words, you shed information in the world by going outside, by participating in social media, by filling out whatever it is you are. And it doesn't occur to you that a system can be brought to bear upon that can make a very strong inference about something that you hold to be quite private. And that's something that I think the law is also grappling with, for example, in a series of Supreme Court decisions. So, anyway, I'm not sure if that's responsive, but we are in a place where we're genuinely trying to figure out how these new technologies should apply.
So I think Oren framed things very well in the beginning, pointing out that we've got a technology here that in many ways can offer a significant improvement over the current state, and at the same time has a new set of potentially negative implications. We have to balance these things. I wonder if we look towards the future for each of you, what's an area that you think deserves particular attention if we're to better bring AI into the service of equity and inclusion and in some sense our lives in general? It's clear that this technology is not going away. It's clear that its utilization is going to increase rapidly, and it's clear that it's going to touch everyone's lives increasingly. And the question is, how do we mitigate the negatives and amplify the positives? Why don't you begin, Oren, since it was your idea? And then we'll go down the row.
Well, I think, again, there's our trainings and biases show in the panel, right? I'm, really not very knowledgeable about the law, so it's just fascinating to me to hear Ryan talk with reverence about the law. I'm used to talking disparagingly about lawyers. Sorry. And again, I'm not sure if I fully agree, but definitely Ryan knows so much more than I do on this topic, and so it's refreshing. So, but what's natural for me to think about is machine learning technology and what we can do there. And so one specific thing is these machine learning technologies have what's called an objective function. They're trying to optimize some mathematical function, and putting it again in non-technical terms, that function embodies a set of values. And so to the extent that we want the system to have other values, there are mathematical and algorithmic tools that we can put in place to change that. So I think that's point number one, and that's an area of active research. Mark Yetzgar, who did his PhD here, is doing a young investigator at AI2, won a Best Paper Award in EMNLP for a system that tries to ameliorate that kind of algorithmic bias that's put on top of the data bias in AI systems. So there's very specific technical work. One other a quick example to think about is I wrote a paper on a notion that we called AI guardians. And it's a very simple idea to have other AI systems that attempt to monitor and keep up with the ones that you're concerned about, right? So often these algorithms are making so many decisions that it's just impossible to keep up. And again, there's practical issues with transparency, which we all want, but how do we get there? And so building systems that audit and monitor these other systems to flag when they're misbehaving in a number of ways. And so I think that's also an exciting area.
Great, Ryan.
Oh, well, I mean, so I think that anytime you have a technology that, while the techniques have been around for some time, but is at least newly powerful, right? Anytime you have a technology that's truly potentially transformative, it offers a nice moment where you can ask yourself whether or not you can deliver on the promises that you've made as a society, and even perhaps make new promises. And I think that, to me, what artificial intelligence invites the justice system that I do hold in high reverence in many ways. I acknowledge it's deeply flawed.
Not the justice system.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it's a common misconception. I mean, people always talk about the famous Shakespeare quote of first kill all the lawyers. That was uttered by a person who was trying to set up a tyranny, right? Just take out the lawyers first, and then next the poets, because they're going to be the ones who are going to resist tyranny. I often hear from sorry, I don't mean this in impassioned defense of law, but I often hear from engineers, or just sort of or overhear disparaging remarks like, "Oh, lawyers, you don't build anything." You know what I mean? Yeah, we do. We built and maintain the rule of law. And that, you're welcome. That's a very important, thing. Anyway, but the point is that I think there are ways that we can use artificial intelligence to improve access. And I want to mirror Mike's point. One really good example of that I got from Tino Cuellar, who's a justice on the California Supreme Court, is there's lots of people that can't get access to the courts in a timely fashion because English is not their first language. Meanwhile, there are translation functions that allow us to speak across multiple disciplines. Now, I can hear Emily inhaling next to me, and she's going to say, "Yeah, but there are a lot of problems. They're sexist. In one instance, Facebook mistranslated a variant of Arabic, causing the Israeli police to believe that someone had said, let's kill everyone, instead of what he actually said, which was good morning, everyone, on Facebook. And so there are perils. But there are also situations and safeguards that could allow people to not have to wait for a translator to be available in order to get what they need from our system. So I think that there's a lot of promise here, and I think we could continue to improve the legal system with these tools.
Emily.
Thanks. I'm excited to be able to build on that notion of translation in the law.
Build on it.
Disagree. Well, not necessarily. So the point that I want to make is that from the inside, from working with people who are building this stuff, again, specifically in the natural language domain, what I see is a real need for a regulatory regime that will change the incentives. Because right now, we do not have an incentive towards transparency, and we also don't have an incentive towards slowing down and doing it carefully. Right. It's one of the things that makes me most want to say I'm not in AI is the way that everything has to happen so fast. Like, you got to get the paper up on archive, you're going to get scooped. It's like, that does not seem like a recipe for getting things done in a way that is really going to serve the public interest. And so what I want from the law system, and thank you for building and maintaining it, is the incentives that will sort of push this wonderful creative energy and the sort of sense of discovery and the enthusiasm that's coming out of the tech community, guide it towards something that really will safeguard the public interest. Because without that kind of guidance, there seems to be a lot of tendency to go for the flashy tools and the better numbers, and it's really hard to get people to slow down and think about, but how is this affecting people and language as people? So I want transparency, and a couple of the ideas I have around transparency, specifically in the machine translation context, is I worry about cases where the people using it don't know just how uncertain it is, right? And so if you were ever going to use machine translation in a context where you're on the field of what was it, pain and death?
Pain and death, yeah.
Then everybody involved in that translation situation needs to know that that's the machine's best guess that could well be wrong, and maybe it's like, with a big red flag around it. We are helping you bridge something here, but take everything with a grain of salt, because this is not what that person said. It's the machine's best guess as to how to map those words into words of your language.
But Emily, are you worried at all that when you slow things down while you're going through that deliberative process with the best of motivations, that people are dying in cars, that people are dying in hospitals, that people are not getting legal representation in the right way? So I think one reason for urgency is commercial incentives, but another reason for urgency is an ethical one, which is while we in Seattle comfortably debate these fine points of the law and these fine points of fairness, people are dying. People are being deported. And so, yeah, I'm in a rush because I want to make the world a better place.
So yes, I absolutely.
Before your son gets on the road. Sorry.
I have a kid who's finishing driver's ed. We had hoped 10 years ago that was going to be moot by now, but it's not. So yes, there absolutely is urgency, but I also think that we can't just charge ahead and say, I'm making the world a better place, without doing the due diligence to make sure that we are. And I think you and I are in agreement in that question. And the way to do that due diligence is to make sure that everyone has a seat at the table. And it's not just you and me and those of us comfortably here in Seattle who are deciding in our beneficence what's good for the rest of the world.
There are many instances, of course, where there's a trade-off between caution and progress. And I think it's a balance that has to be struck, and it's something that's worth debating. Mike?
Yeah, first I got to say, as Ryan was referring to Shakespeare on the law, I was reminded of a Seinfeld quote, which was, lawyers are those annoying people that took the time to read all the instructions on the back of a board game, and then you try to play the game and they'll interpret. So maybe the rules aren't bad, it's those who read. I don't know. We can debate that too. But there are a couple things that make me optimistic.
I have a son who is one, and it's annoyed me for 30 years.
Yeah, can you read all the rules? That's the first question. I mean, find that you're inclined from an early age.
Do you read the terms of service?
No, I shouldn't say that on camera, actually. Yes, I do. Since we're being recorded, absolutely every word. No, a couple things make me optimistic here. One is I do think that as we're going around and talking with policymakers, I was in Dubai, for example, a couple of weeks ago at this World Government Summit, and there is tremendous interest again in AI, but coupled with that, just very careful attention to precisely the kinds of issues that we're talking about. And so what makes me optimistic is I think whether you're talking with major players in this space, you're talking with civil society, you're talking with policymakers, there's this sense that, wow, this is again, a transformational technology, but we really have to think carefully about these implications. And so more so than I think in other contexts, I've found, at least at the high level on some of these policy issues, there tends to be, I'm finding, more agreement than disagreement about the importance of tackling issues like fairness, tackling issues like accountability. Now, of course, as we start to get into the details, the rules, what exactly are we going to do about this? This is where it's going to get interesting. But again, I'm optimistic because I do think that you're seeing industry come together, at least with a notion that, look, we have to solve this jointly. This is less of a space where, we ought to competitively differentiate on who's better at making sure, we're dealing with bias in data. That's something that should benefit society as a whole. And therefore, at least for now, until we get in and argue some more and get into the details, it feels like there's a trend towards common views on these issues that I think are net positive. The other thing that makes me optimistic is I do feel like there are existing and frankly decades-old approaches to certain issues that, because of the newness, because of the speed of things, I think people are up in arms about how just novel this stuff is. But in reality, we've been through some of these cycles before There was an article I saw recently in the New York Times that talked about the experience in the 60s and 70s as people were dealing with automating credit decisions, and the Equal Credit Opportunity Act of 1974 was a reaction to that. This recognition that we're beginning to automate credit decisions, and so let's have some rules around that. Now, those rules today might not necessarily work. They're going to need to be stretched a bit, but we've got things that we can fall back on and rely on. Similarly, just in 2010, I know, Ryan, you've written about this, the flash crash, and sort of illustrated just how susceptible our worldwide economy might be to automated systems making trading decisions without oversight. And that led the Federal Reserve to impose new regulations to say, whoa, wait a second, if you're a bank under our jurisdiction, these are the rules that you're going to have to follow to really understand what the heck your model is doing. How do you design it? How do you stress check it? How do you monitor it over time? And if you look at those sorts of rules, you realize, wow, yeah, these are the sorts of frameworks that we can leverage. It is going to take a lot of work and patience to try to get through that, and we are up against this tremendous pressure to do these things quickly because there's so much excitement and benefit to be had. But I'm optimistic, and I think there are good frameworks out there that as we all calm down a little bit, we can leverage and do some good things with.
That's a great point. Emily?
So 2 points about preventing bias in data inputs. When working with public sector data, there's a lot of data collected by nonprofit service providers that then becomes part of the larger data set. And for one example, with a local homelessness agency that collects data manually that provided to King County under the Homeless Management Information System, and just want to note a few of the data issues that come up, which then get translated into this larger data set. They have a lot of duplicates due to clients with multiple names, a high quantity of self-reported information on living history, an outdated software system that they have a hard time raising funds to replace because it's seen as an administrative cost rather than direct service. And their decisions about which data to collect are often based on what funders ask for. And they have a ton of data on Seattle-based clients and very little data on people who move from out of state. And I'm putting those points forward just to emphasize the importance of considering the data context. There's a common narrative that data scientists and tech experts should be helping out these nonprofits who don't have that kind of expertise, but understanding the nuances from within and having a two-way street of that dialogue, I think, is very important. And we have an active project as part of Urbanalytics that Bill Howe is one of the co-PIs with Drexel University, working on addressing bias earlier in the data lifecycle, looking at things like non-representative samples, attaching metadata, dealing with weakly structured data sets, and generating synthetic data that can be statistically similar to, but protecting the raw data. So I think thinking about the issues that creep in throughout the data lifecycle, not just at the end in the algorithm phase, is also important.
So just big picture, I think that looking ahead around frameworks in this space, there's a role for policymakers who are, I think, inordinately afraid of regulating in this space because they think they're going to kill innovation. They're actually not. Innovation will survive regulation in this space. There's a role for policymakers. There's a role for the vendors, the private sector that's building these tools. And I think there's a role for communities to engage as well. And I think the frameworks that we need to build are really around transparency and accountability and fairness, right? They largely mirror sort of the buzzwords that I talk about. Transparency is something that, for example, New York City has started to do, right? So they just passed a task force that essentially surfaces all algorithmic decision making in the city. I think that's a good step one. Accountability, I think, means a way for communities to engage with the technologies that impact them. So we have an analog here in Seattle called the Seattle Surveillance Ordinance. It's the strongest one in the country. It is surfacing all these surveillance technologies that have already been acquired without any public debate whatsoever. We need to do something like that for algorithms as well, right? And be able to encompass those technologies in a way that allows us to talk about what values we want to have around them. And engage in the discussion. And then I think, clear parameters around specific applications of these technologies that come out of that discussion, right? So should we all be subject to suspicionless facial recognition via body cameras, right? That's a real-time example that may be coming to a street in Seattle near you very soon. Have you had the chance to talk to your city council about it? Not yet. But if we put these transparency mechanisms in place, we can do that. Pending that, private actors can actually have an evolving set of ethical evaluation frameworks to be able to work with. I saw recently a very good one by the BC Safety Authority where I thought they actually did a pretty good job. They convened stakeholders before they implemented the technology to actually figure out what the impact was going to be on stakeholders. They asked a lot of the right questions. So those frameworks are starting to exist and become a little bit more standardized. And for people who are building the technology, I think it's the same process of asking the right questions ahead of time. I want to recommend a really good paper to you, which encapsulates a lot of these issues. It's one of the few that I've seen that actually involves the human element as well as the mathematical element in AI. It was written 18 months ago. It's called Algorithmic Transparency for the Smart City. I re-reviewed it last night when I was thinking about what to say today, and I actually realized it encapsulates a lot of the things and the questions we should be asking around technologies that are being deployed in our name with our tax dollars in the public space. So if you want to get deeper, that's a good place to go.
Great, thank you very much. We have time for one 30-second provocative question and a 60-second answer. Please.
So a lot of conversations about AI seem to revolve around this lack of agency. We don't totally understand how the algorithm works. I work with undergraduates to try to forward some of those discussions, but they evoke similar difficulty addressing these wicked structural problems and then perceive their role more as a sort of code monkey and engineering mindset.
We need a question mark pretty soon.
Regardless of whether we think they should have the most agency, how do we forward those discussions, given that the recent Wired article mentioned that Facebook engineers have the greatest say on the direction of the company?
Please.
Every single assignment in your class could ask, what could go wrong?
It was a great answer. The obvious other point, right, is to increase the diversity of the people involved, so they think, naturally about more of the issues.
Yeah, David Hendry in the iSchool has developed a curricular module for to plug into engineering courses. You might want to reach out to David.
Excellent. Before we thank the panel, let me thank you for being here today. Let me ask you to join us at 3:30 for the Ben Tasker Memorial Lecture. And let me ask you to think of Ben and his wife and their daughter, not just today, but every day. So, panelists, thank you.